Before we get started, hit the comments and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Whether you're catching sunrise in Nairobi, burning midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to hear from you. Don't just watch silently, let me know where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. They dragged him through the snow by his collar, boots scraping, ribs burning, breath torn out of him in white bursts. The wire fence hummed in the wind like it was alive. Searchlights cut the dark into hard squares, and somewhere a dog barked, sharp and hungry. A rifle but cracked against his spine and he went down on one knee. The Germans laughed, easy laughter, bored laughter, the kind men use when they believe the ending is already written. Blood ran warm at the corner of his mouth, salty and coppery. He tasted it, swallowed and lifted his head. His name was Elias Corinne and he smiled. Not wide. Not wild. Just enough. The smile landed wrong. One soldier frowned. Another spat. Elias laughed, soft, dry, almost amused. That was when the first punch came and it should have broken him. It didn't. They shoved him into the yard, a rectangle of trampled snow and shadow. 21 soldiers closed in, coats buttoned tight, helmets dull under the lamps. Fingers flexed on triggers. A captain stepped forward, boots clean, eyes flat. He spoke in clipped syllables Elias understood too well. You think this is funny? The captain nodded, and a guard struck Elias across the face. The world rang. Teeth cut skin. Still, Elias laughed again. He heard his own breath, steady. He felt the old calm slide into place, the one that came only when fear burned away and left focus behind. The captain's mouth tightened. Search him. Hands grabbed, rough and eager. They missed the smallest things. They always did. A glove tossed aside. A watch pocketed. The snow creaked as men shifted, confident. Someone joked. Someone else stepped too close. The yard smelled like oil and wet wool. Elias counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. He remembered the sound of his mother's kettle back home, how it sang before boiling. He remembered the weight of a promise. The laugh he gave this time was different, short, sharp. It cut the cold. The captain raised a hand to strike again. Elias moved. Not fast to the eye, efficient. A step inside the guard's reach. A twist. A crack. The first man fell without a sound, throat crushed. The yard froze for a half second, surprise snapping tight as wire. Elias took the rifle as it dropped, spun, fired once. Then again. The noise tore the night open. Men shouted. Someone screamed. The dog went silent. What followed would later be argued about in whispers and reports and broken sleep. They would say it took longer. They would say fewer men fell. They would say Elias Corinne had help. None of that was true. It lasted 45 seconds. In that time, the yard became a storm of motion and breath and mistakes. Elias used the lamp's glare to blind, the snow to slide, the panic to herd. He broke a wrist, fired 3 shots, threw a knife he had no right to have. Men tripped over each other. Orders tangled. When the last body hit the ground, the wire still hummed. Elias stood alone, chest heaving, hands shaking, not with fear but with the aftershock of survival. Sirens wailed in the distance. He looked toward the gate. He did not run. He listened. And somewhere deep inside, the past began to knock, hard, demanding to be let in. Long before the wire, before the laughter and the guns, Elias Corinne learned how to be invisible. He grew up in Vesna Hollow, a narrow village folded between dark pines and stubborn hills, where winters came early and left late. The houses leaned inward as if sharing secrets. People there spoke softly, saved words, and measured men by how little they complained. Elias was the third son, which meant he learned early not to ask for much. His father taught him how to cut wood without wasting strength, how to watch the sky for weather shifts, how to keep his hands steady even when the cold bit deep. Control, his father said once, gripping Elias's wrist until the bones ached. Control is the difference between living and being remembered. Elias didn't understand then. He would. The war crept in quietly at first. Boots on distant roads. Trains that didn't stop anymore. Faces that vanished between Sundays. Elias watched his older brothers leave one by one, their shoulders squared, their eyes hiding fear behind pride. The village women cried into scarves. The men drank and pretended not to count who was left. Elias stayed. Not because he was spared but because someone had to keep the house standing. He worked nights hauling grain and days repairing fences. He learned routes through the woods that didn't show on maps. He learned how to move without sound, how to breathe slow when panic tried to rise. When soldiers finally came for him, he didn't argue. He packed light. He kissed his mother's forehead. His father didn't hug him. just pressed a small hard thing into his palm. For when the noise starts, he said. Training was not heroic. It was mud, shouted orders, and mistakes punished fast. Elias didn't stand out. He didn't try to. He listened. He watched men who talked too much break first. He learned to fire until recoil felt like a heartbeat. He learned that fear could be folded, tucked away, used later. A captain noticed his calm and put him on patrols others avoided. Forest edges. Night crossings. Jobs where silence mattered more than speed. Elias made it back every time, boots soaked, eyes sharp. He never bragged. He never slept deeply. When a mission went wrong, when the ambush came early and bullets stitched the dark, Elias did not freeze. He moved. He dragged a wounded man out under fire, then went back for another. He came back bleeding and quiet. They gave him a medal he never wore. Capture came not with a battle cry, but with hunger and exhaustion. The wrong turn. A patrol that shouldn't have been there. Elias fought until the magazine clicked empty, until his hands burned. When they took him, he looked at the faces around him and stored them away. He counted steps. He counted breaths. He remembered the hard thing his father gave him, hidden where hands didn't search well. In the truck, bound and bruised, a soldier laughed at him. Elias did not answer. He watched the road. He memorized the turns. The camp rose out of the snow like a scar. Wire, towers, lights. Elias felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not rage. Purpose. He understood then why his father had spoken of control. Why silence mattered. Why some men survived long enough to be underestimated. As the gate closed behind him and the dogs barked, Elias lifted his eyes to the guard tower and made a decision he did not yet fully name. The wire hummed. And somewhere ahead, the noise was coming. The camp ran on routine, and routine made men careless. Elias learned that in the first week. Roll calls at dawn and dusk. Soup thin enough to see the bottom of the tin. Boots lined up outside barracks like obedient animals. Guards who checked faces, not hands. Who counted bodies, not breaths. Elias kept his head down and his movements small. He watched how long a guard lingered on a joke. He noted which ones tightened their belts after meals. He learned the sound of keys on a ring, how the rhythm changed when a man was tired. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the wind pressed the barracks walls inward, Elias listened. The wire sang. The camp breathed. They searched him 3 times that first month. Once rough, twice bored. They found nothing worth keeping. They missed the seam he'd re-stitched with a thread pulled from his own sleeve. They missed the weight that wasn't weight at all, pressed flat and patient. They missed how Elias shifted his balance when he walked, protecting one side without looking like he was guarding anything. He let them take the watch. He let them laugh when they found a photograph of a woman he didn't know. He learned the names they used for him. Quiet one. Hollow eyes. Dead already. Each name slid off him like snow. Inside the barracks, men broke in different ways. One talked to himself until guards dragged him out. Another hoarded crumbs and cried when they were stolen. Elias shared what he could, said little, and remembered faces. He found Merrick, a former teacher with shaking hands, and Tomas, a boy who tried to hide his fear behind jokes. Elias showed them how to wrap cloth around boots to muffle steps. He taught them how to sleep in short pieces without dreaming too hard. When Tomas asked why, Elias said, "Because night is when mistakes get loud." The boy nodded, though he didn't understand. Not yet. Work details took them beyond the inner fence. Snow shoveling. Wood cutting. Repairs to the outer line. Guards smoked and complained. Elias watched their patterns. He noticed the lamp that flickered near the yard, the one that threw shadows just wrong. He noticed the captain who liked to step close when he talked, as if proximity were a weapon. Elias let the man feel powerful. He laughed at jokes he didn't find funny. He bent when ordered. Control, he told himself. Control was the difference. The night before it happened, Elias couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because the air felt tight like a held breath. He traced the edge of the thing hidden where hands didn't search well. He thought of Vesna Hollow, of his father's grip, of the kettle singing. He thought of the promise he'd made without words, to himself, to the men who wouldn't make it home. In the dark, Merrick whispered, "Do you think anyone is watching us?" Elias answered honestly. "Always." Merrick swallowed and turned away. Morning came gray and brittle. Orders were sharper. A guard shoved Tomas for moving too slow. Elias laughed then, soft, careless, just enough to draw eyes. The guard looked at him, annoyed. Good, Elias thought. See me. Miss the rest. When they marched him later, when hands grabbed and confidence bloomed, Elias felt the plan lock into place. Not a plan written down. A shape. A rhythm. The camp thought it owned time. Elias knew better. As the yard opened and the lights flared, he counted heartbeats again. 1, 2, 3. And waited for the smallest thing they would miss. They brought him out at night because night made men feel braver. The lamps washed the yard in harsh white, turning breath into ghosts and shadows into lies. The captain circled Elias slowly, boots crunching, coat stiff with authority. He asked questions that weren't meant to be answered. Names. Units. Routes. Elias gave him nothing useful, shrugs, half-truths, a quiet smile that landed like an insult. The captain's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, close enough for Elias to smell tobacco and oil. "You think you're special," the captain said. Elias met his eyes and said nothing. Silence, he knew, was a mirror. Men hated what they saw there. They tied his hands and left him standing while the guards talked among themselves. This was the part Elias loved least, the waiting, the pretending to be small. Snow crept into his boots. The lamp flickered, just as he'd seen before, dim, bright, dim. Each flick stole a heartbeat of certainty from the men around him. Elias shifted his weight a fraction, testing the knot. Gave a little. Not enough. Yet. A guard laughed at something Tomas said nearby, then shoved the boy hard. Tomas stumbled. Elias felt the old heat rise and folded it down. Control. The captain nodded to a guard. A fist came, fast and practiced. Elias rolled with it, letting pain slide past the bone. The guard overreached. Elias smiled again, wrong, deliberate. The yard went quiet in that way crowds do right before something breaks. A dog barked once and fell silent. Someone muttered a curse. The captain raised a hand to strike again. That was the signal Elias had been waiting for, not the hand but the step. The captain stepped inside the lamp's glare, blinding himself for a blink. It was enough. Elias moved like he was slipping into a coat. A twist of the wrist. The knot loosened. He dipped under the blow, took the guard's balance, and crushed the throat with a short, ugly sound. The rifle was in his hands before the body hit the snow. He fired once at the lamp. Darkness spilled sideways. Men shouted. Orders tangled. Elias fired again, then again, each shot chosen, each step placed where panic would do the rest. He slid on the snow and came up behind a man who was raising his weapon, breaking the wrist, taking the knife. He threw it without looking. A scream cut off. Time stretched and snapped. 45 seconds became a tunnel of breath and motion. Elias used the fence to funnel, the bodies to trip. He didn't chase. He let fear run into him. When it ended, the yard was a mess of dropped weapons and stillness. Elias stood shaking, not from cold. Sirens wailed beyond the outer fence. He looked at the gate, at the tower, at the men who had underestimated him because it was easier than thinking. He didn't run. He knelt and closed Tomas's eyes, whispering a promise he intended to keep. Lights flared. Boots thundered closer. Elias raised his hands, not in surrender but to show them empty. He laughed once more, softer now, and waited for the next shape the silence would take. The sirens didn't sound like victory. They sounded like punishment. Red lights spun across the yard, cutting the dark into frantic pieces. Boots pounded from every direction, heavy and angry. Elias stayed where he was, hands open, breath slow. Around him lay the proof of what he'd done, 21 shapes in the snow, some still, some broken in ways that could never be fixed. The air smelled like cordite and iron. A guard screamed for medics who didn't come fast enough. Elias felt no pride. Only a deep, settling weight. This was the price. He had always known there would be one. They tackled him hard, too many hands at once, fists and knees and rifle stocks. Pain bloomed and faded in waves. He didn't fight back. He couldn't afford to. Control, he told himself, even as the world narrowed to boots and breath and the crunch of snow against his cheek. When they hauled him upright, blood ran down his chin and froze there. The captain stood a few steps back, pale now, eyes darting to the bodies as if they might rise. How? He demanded. Elias met his gaze and said the truth. You stopped watching. They dragged Elias through corridors he hadn't seen before, concrete, damp, echoing. Doors slammed. A cell swallowed him whole. No window. One bulb humming like an insect. They left him there with his thoughts and the ache in his bones. Time slipped. He counted breaths. He replayed the yard not to savor it but to measure it. What he'd done right. What he'd done wrong. Tomas's face came back to him, young and afraid. Elias pressed his forehead to the wall until the cold bit. I'm sorry, he whispered to no one and everyone. Interrogation came in pieces. Questions. Silence. More questions. They wanted a story that made sense. A trick. An accomplice. A miracle. Elias gave them none. He let them bruise him. He let them threaten worse. He watched the captain's hands shake when he thought Elias wasn't looking. Fear had found a new home. That mattered. Days later, or nights, Elias couldn't tell, they moved him again. This time past the inner fence toward the outer gate. Prisoners watched from shadows, eyes wide, whispers chasing his steps. Elias caught Marek's gaze for a heartbeat and nodded once. Live the nod said, "Remember." The truck waited, engine coughing. As they shoved him aboard, Elias saw the flickering lamp in the yard finally replaced. Fixed. Too late. The truck rolled out under a sky the color of steel. Elias leaned back against the wood and closed his eyes. He didn't know where they were taking him. He knew only this: the camp would never be the same. And neither would he. The road east unspooled like a punishment that refused to end. The truck rattled over frozen ruts, each jolt sending pain through Elias's ribs. Chains bit his wrists, cold metal against colder skin. The guards sat opposite him, rifles across their knees, eyes fixed anywhere but his face. Dawn crept in slow and gray, lifting fog from fields scarred by tracks and shell holes. Elias watched it all through a crack in the slats. He kept his breathing even. He counted the turns. He listened to the engine note rise and fall. Control, he reminded himself. Control was how you stayed alive when the world decided you were already dead. They stopped once by a stand of black trees. Steam hissed from the engine. A guard climbed down to smoke, boots crunching loud in the quiet. Elias felt the thing he'd lost in the yard, his small edge, missing like a tooth. Good, he thought. Grief sharpens. He closed his eyes and pictured Vesna hollow. The kettle. His father's hand. The promise. When the guard glanced at him and smirked, Elias smiled back, not defiant now but calm. The guard looked away first. At the rail depot the air tasted of coal and frost. They transferred him to a cattle car with other prisoners, men who smelled of fear and damp wool. Some stared. Some turned away. Elias sat, back to the wall, conserving heat, conserving words. A man beside him whispered, "What did you do?" Elias answered softly, "I survived." The train lurched forward. Chains clinked. Someone began to pray. Someone else laughed and then cried. Elias watched the crack of light slide along the floor and disappear. The new camp announced itself with silence. Taller fences. Wider yards. Guards who didn't joke. The commandant looked at Elias like a problem to be solved, not a story to be told. They took his name and gave him a number. They shaved his hair. They searched him again, careful this time, thorough. Elias felt lighter afterward, stripped to essentials. They put him to work breaking stone, then hauling it back where it came from. Futile labor. Intentional. Elias did the work and watched. He learned which guards counted. Which ones rushed. Which ones feared night. Weeks passed. Or maybe months. Elias marked time by the ache in his hands and the way the sky shifted. He kept his head down. He made himself small again. But something had changed. Whispers followed him. A look held too long. Men tested his calm with questions they didn't want answered. Elias gave them steadiness instead. He shared water. He shared silence. At night he taught men how to breathe through pain. How to sleep without surrendering. One evening as the lamps flickered on, Elias felt it, the held breath again. The shape of something moving. Not a riot. Not an escape. A reckoning. He looked toward the gate and thought of the yard he'd left behind, the lamp they'd fixed too late. Control, he told himself, smiling faintly as the wire began to hum. The quiet didn't shatter all at once. Cracked. Small sounds went missing first, the jokes guards used to tell, the careless jingling of keys. Orders came clipped now, faces tight. Elias felt it in his bones as he hauled stone across the yard, each step measured, each breath counted. He watched a guard drop his cigarette and grind it out too hard. He saw the way men flinched at distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. The war was moving. Camps were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to hold time still. Time was slipping. That night, in the barracks, Elias sat with Merrick and two others beneath a flickering bulb. No one spoke at first. Then Merrick whispered, "They're moving prisoners again." Elias nodded. He'd seen the list. Transfers meant trains. Trains meant fewer chances. He traced a line in the dust with his finger, routes he'd memorized, gaps he'd counted. "We don't run," he said quietly. "We wait." A man scoffed, bitter. Elias didn't argue. He met the man's eyes and said, "Waiting is a kind of motion." The scoff died. Work changed. Guards paired up. Searchlight stayed on longer. A new officer arrived with a scar across his cheek and a habit of standing too close. He watched Elias like a man watching a storm build, curious and afraid. During roll call, a prisoner collapsed. The officer ordered him dragged aside and left. Elias stepped forward without thinking. A rifle snapped up. Silence spread. Elias stopped, raised his hands and met the officer's gaze. "Water?" Elias said. "Just that." The officer hesitated, then nodded. The man lived. Something else broke. The night of the move came with snow. Trucks idled. Names were shouted. Elias felt the shape lock into place. Not hope, not escape. Responsibility. He leaned to Merrick and pressed something small into his palm. A scrap of wire, bent just so. "When the lights go," Elias whispered, "count to 3. Mark's hand shook. Elias squeezed once. Control. They marched. Boots, chains, breath. At the gate, a shout, then a crack as a lamp popped and went dark. Another flicker. Men froze. Elias moved. He took a step that pulled a guard's balance, another that stole a rifle. He didn't fire. He swung. He pushed. He let panic bloom just enough. Prisoners surged, not running, not fighting, flowing. Orders drowned in noise. Elias grabbed Merrick and shoved him toward the shadow between trucks. "Now," he said. It lasted longer than the yard. "Messier." Louder. Elias felt pain bloom and kept moving. When it ended, sirens wailed again, but farther off this time. Elias stood in the snow, breath tearing at his chest, watching shadows scatter into the trees. He did not follow. He turned back toward the camp, toward the lights still burning. Control, he told himself. One last time. The forest swallowed sound, but it could not swallow consequence. Searchlights clawed at the trees, turning branches into bones. Elias ran not away but across, cutting angles, breaking patterns, making pursuit expensive. Snow grabbed his boots. Pain flared where a rib shifted wrong. He welcomed it. Pain was honest. He ducked behind a fallen trunk as shots cracked, bark exploding into his face. He counted breaths again. 1, 2, 3. Control. When the lights slid past, he moved, low and steady, toward the place where wire met shadow. He reached the fence as engines roared behind him. The outer line had a weakness he'd seen weeks ago. Posts sunk shallow, ground thawed by leaking steam pipes. Elias wedged the bent wire Merrick had carried back into the seam and leaned. Metal sang. He leaned again. A shout cut the dark. Elias slipped through as the fence gave, tearing his coat, taking skin. He didn't slow. He ran until the lights were smaller, until the sounds thinned to a rumor. Dawn found him in a hollow with frozen reeds and a creek that refused to stop moving. Elias knelt and drank, the cold burning his throat. He pressed snow to his face and watched the sky lighten, thinking of 45 seconds that would follow him forever. Not as pride. As a marker. Before and after. He tore cloth for a bandage, tied it with teeth and listened. The forest breathed back. He traveled by night, hid by day. He avoided roads, crossed them only where ditches deepened and sightlines died. Hunger gnawed. Sleep came in scraps. Once he saw smoke and turned away. Another time he heard a child laugh from a farmhouse and kept moving. Control. Each choice carried weight now. He could feel it in his hands. Days later, boots found him again, not German this time. Different cadence. Different language carried on the wind. Elias watched from brush as a small unit passed, worn uniforms, eyes sharp. Resistance. He stepped out with hands raised and said a single word he knew would land right. The leader studied him, then nodded. They fed him soup that tasted like life. They didn't ask for stories. They asked what he could do. The answer came not in words. It came when a patrol crossed their path at dusk. Elias pointed. He moved. The unit followed. He showed them how to turn fear sideways, how to let men make their own mistakes. The skirmish was brief. Cling. When it ended, the leader clapped Elias's shoulder once and said, "Stay." Elias did. Winter loosened its grip. The war cracked open along seams no one could hide anymore. Camps emptied or burned. Trains ran the wrong way. Elias moved with the resistance through villages and forests, breaking lines, opening doors. He never laughed again like he had in the yard. He didn't need to. The work spoke. When the fighting finally rolled past Vesna Hollow, Elias came home to a house still standing. His father's chair sat where it always had. The kettle sang. Elias stood in the doorway and let the sound wash him clean. Control, he thought, not as a weapon now but as a promise kept. The war's end did not arrive with a trumpet. It arrived with silence first, then whispers, then the sight of retreating boots on frost-bitten roads. Elias walked into Vesna Hollow through the forest's edge, eyes scanning houses like a soldier checking corners, heart caught between relief and disbelief. Smoke still lingered over chimneys, neighbors peeking from windows, mouths open in awe. He felt the weight of the yard again, 21 men 45 seconds, laughter, survival. But he also felt something new, the absence of fear. The village was quiet. He let himself breathe. For now. But the reckoning came faster than he expected. Former captors were being processed nearby. One German officer, the scarred captain from the yard, was brought in for questioning. Elias stood behind the crowd, unshaven, coated in travel dust, eyes steady. The captain froze when he recognized him. The same laugh, the same quiet defiance had not been forgotten. No one else spoke, the air held a tense hush. Elias stepped forward. Not in vengeance but in clarity. "Do you remember the yard?" he asked softly. The captain nodded, lips pale, hands trembling. Elias looked at him, letting the weight of what had been done settle without a word of accusation. The truth hung heavier than any sentence. Other prisoners, survivors from nearby camps, saw him then. They stepped forward. Some bowed heads, some clutched hands, some shook with quiet tears. Tomas appeared, older now, face thin and eyes wide. Elias met his gaze. No words were needed. They knew. They had lived. They had counted the heartbeats. Merrick approached, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You kept us alive," he said. Elias only nodded, the quiet answering louder than any speech. The captain's silence became the village's acknowledgement of survival, of control, of justice wrought in the way only necessity can forge. That night, Elias walked along the frozen creek at the edge of the village. The sky was a deep purple, frost-laden, stars sharp as needles. He traced the path his father had once shown him, imagining the kettle singing in the house behind him. The memory of the yard, the prisoners, the captured chaos began to shrink, not because it was forgotten but because it no longer controlled him. He remembered the lessons of control, of patience, of choosing when to strike and when to wait. 45 seconds had changed everything. 45 seconds had given life and taken it. But now he was free of their measure. In the village square, a small crowd gathered to rebuild fences, haul wood, and clean streets. Elias joined, silent, letting hands and sweat speak for him. Children stared, not in fear but awe, sensing the calm in the man who had endured and emerged whole. The snow softened under the dawn, and the kettle sang in the distance. Elias smiled faintly, not the laugh in the yard, but a smile that carried warmth, memory, and the quiet knowledge that he had survived what no one else could. Control at last became peace. Elias stepped into his house and let the door close behind him. The walls smelled of smoke and wood polish, familiar and unchanged as if the years had passed elsewhere. He shed his coat, gloves, and dust of war, folding them neatly on the chair his father once sat in. The kettle sang in the kitchen, a simple whistle, a sound so ordinary it brought tears he did not bother to stop. He let them fall, silent and warm against the quiet of the room. Years of fear, of survival, of the yard and the 45 seconds that had defined him, they all settled like snow on the windowsill. Here for the first time they did not weigh him down. His father appeared then, older, stooped, but with eyes still sharp. No words were exchanged at first. None were needed. The man simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of what Elias had endured, of the boy he raised and the man who returned. His mother's hands clutched his face, trembling, tears streaking soot and dirt from a face he thought the war had taken from her long ago. "You're home," she whispered. Elias smiled softly. Yes, he thought. At last he was home. The war could not take this. Not this small, precious fragment of life, where he was known, remembered, and safe. Outside, Vesna Hollow stirred to life again. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Children ran through the snow, their laughter sharp and honest. Neighbors cleared paths and repaired fences, the village reclaiming itself inch by inch. Elias stepped outside to watch them, shoulders straight, breath lifting into the crisp morning. He remembered the soldiers, the captors, the men who had fallen in the yard and the boys who had survived by his side. He honored them quietly in the stillness, in the way he moved through the world, careful, steady, aware. 45 seconds had tested everything he knew. But now he understood control, courage, and mercy. He returned to the creek behind his house, where snow and ice shimmered under the pale sun. Elias knelt, cupped water in his hands and let it spill slowly, silently, back into the creek. Life had returned, fragile and unbroken. The world had shifted, the war had passed, and yet here he was, whole, marked by memory but free. He raised his head and smiled at the sunrise, letting it light his face. In the distance, the kettle whistled again. Elias Corinne laughed softly, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in gratitude. The war was over. The yard, the wire, the 45 seconds they were behind him. He was home.